What's good, DMV Sports Zone? This is Noah, back with your regularly scheduled fantasy sports recap for the Washington Wizards and the Washington Capitals. Before we get started, the theme of today's video, some of my takes have aged kind of badly, particularly with Vanacek and Samsonov. Of course, things could change week to week, but that's why I'm here to keep updated on what the trajectory of the season is. But for the NBA and the Wizards, unfortunately, my pessimism was correct. We are having an absolute disaster second half of the season, and more importantly, a fantasy disaster for a lot of players. So before I get into it any further, all my data is coming from SportyEye, the app that is democratizing the fantasy sports analytics process. You want to learn more information, the link is in the bio. So without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome back to DMV Sports Zone.
Chased down by Beal in the corner for three, gets fouled and hits.
Welcome to DC.
Well, they tag him out.
You know when you're at the USA Cup, you're taking it slightly. I'm taking it slightly. Now how you gon' act when we gon' be right back? When we gon' be right here, we gon' be right here. We ain't going nowhere. Welcome to DC. DC, the home of Chuck Brown. Oh, you don't know the sound? Well, let me break it down.
So first things first, let's talk about the Washington Capitals. They had a mediocre start to the January, but finished off pretty strong. So interestingly enough, Vita Vanacek has, like I said before, kind of taken over the starting role over Samsonov. There was a stretch where Samsonov hadn't played for 5 games before coming in and playing a couple weeks, 2 weeks ago. But this past week, it's been all Vanacek. He's raised his numbers to just under a 92% save percentage and a 2.35 goals against average, including a very impressive 28 save shutout against the San Jose Sharks this past week. What does that mean for the future? Again, there's no guarantees. I had mentioned before that maybe it started out as it's worth keeping both in a rotation. Then you should drop Vanacek. But now she's like, should you drop Samsonov? But now it's clear Laviolette's going to always go with the hot hand. At this point, having both on your rosters are incredibly valuable. Vanacek's still only owned in 28% of leagues. So, especially with the Caps getting a lot of their games delayed earlier in the season because of COVID, they're going to have a lot more of a game-heavy schedule, meaning Samsonov and Vanacek will both get a healthy run and be extremely valuable as goaltenders, especially good goaltenders, are very hard to come by in fantasy with a good team like the Capitals. I recommend now that for at least a foreseeable future, you do that duo tandem. You get Vanacek and Samsonov on your fantasy rosters as soon as possible. Another player to keep a note on is Nicholas Backstrom, back from injury. I mentioned that he is a fantasy sports disappointment because you got to look at it from the entire season's perspective so far. However, that second half of the season, looking like he could be pretty good, coming off a 3-point night in a big win, and now has 12 points in 12 games. Down the stretch, he can be a very valuable player. So people that did hold him, you may not have gotten the value from a season-long perspective, but he will help you in the playoff push and the championship push later this year. So that wraps up the things about the Capitals. Very positive note in general. Now let's unfortunately turn to the more negative side. Let's talk about the Washington Wizards. So beyond the record from a fantasy perspective, it's been a disaster thus far. Those players that were expected to be very fantasy relevant that have been pretty consistent, including Spencer Dinwiddie, not so much, but Harrell, Daniel Gafford, both are actually having a lot of struggles recently, and a big part of that is surprisingly the rise of Thomas Bryant. I had said before that I thought he was going to be traded, and he still could be traded. Wes Unseld Jr. really is showing signs that he's maybe showcasing Bryant to a contending team because he's been in the starting lineup usurping both Harrell and Gafford as the primary center, and he had said he wants to continue to see what Thomas Bryant can do in the starting lineup. I know it makes it look like he's just trying to develop his young players. In reality, I think he's just trying to create trade value for him so they can trade him as soon as possible. Regardless, all the front court players are now suddenly avoidable, with the exception of Kuzma. Kuzma has been the bright spot and actually is in the top 5 power forward rankings for SportyEye. Reason for that is a very hot January. He was averaging 23 points, 11 rebounds, 3 assists, just under 2 threes a game at 1.8. and 1 block a game. That's extremely well-rounded stats, particularly for a power forward position. It was very similar to football. The tight end position is very shallow. The power forward position is a very shallow one in terms of fantasy relevance, as most of the elite forwards you can consider are either small forwards or centers. There are very few true power forwards that are elite. Jason Tatum, Pascal Siakam are both guys that come to mind, but Kuzma, very underrated asset that's really stepping it up, having the best year he's had in a long time, especially from a fantasy perspective. So what does that mean? What do you do with Harrell? What do you do with Gafford? What do you do with Dinwiddie? Of course, people are, the word around the street is, including Wes Unseld said, if Dinwiddie doesn't improve his play, he will be benched. Very similar situation to what's happening to Kemba Walker in New York. Both teams are in free fall. So what does that mean? The trade deadline for a lot of ESPN standard leagues is actually closed, but if it's not, you need to trade him. At this point, just try to salvage some value. He's too inconsistent. Even if he picks up steam, he has lost a lot of his overall value going forward. So you need to, at this point, cut your losses. And they're too good to drop, especially because all these players have had a lot of ADP, a lot of draft capital invested into them. So they're a must trade at this point, and hopefully you can get some value out of them. Because Harrell, Dinwiddie, even Gafford's futures are looking extremely murky, as Hachimura and Bryant are back, contributing decently. And there's such a front court logjam. It's very curious to see what they're going to do with the trade deadline. Looks like Thomas Bryant will be the trade candidate, and then Hachimura will remain. And we'll see if Dinwiddie or Harrell get moved. So if you want to take a speculative look at Bryant, even though I said he has no future with the Wizards, that doesn't mean he has no future for fantasy basketball this year. Keep a very close eye on him. See if a team picks him up. The original teams that I thought were going to pick him up, the Clippers or the Cavaliers, probably don't have any use for him anymore. But with a lot of injuries going around the league, and always in every good playoff team needs a good energy, big man off the bench. We'll see if he goes to a contender and see if he raises his value. Otherwise, the Wizards are, frankly, in a disastrous spot in the real world and in a fantasy perspective. Only remaining relevant players consistently seems to be Kuzma or Bradley Beal. On that note, I want to wrap things up. It's been a pretty quick update. Just want to give you a pulse check on what's going around in both the Capitals and the Wizards. And I'm excited to talk about next week. Hopefully, have some better news for both teams. But for now, it's only the Caps to look forward to. And let's hope that the Wizards don't go into complete free fall. That